But as I said, my name is Pastor Jim, and it's just an honor to have each of you here in church this morning. It's my distinct honor to introduce to you our speaker for this morning. These next couple weeks, I'm actually going to step out of the pulpit because I don't have to preach every single week. We have amazing staff members and others who can step in and fill in and bring the word better than I can. So it's just a joy to have Pastor Bruce sharing with us this morning. If you haven't met Pastor Bruce yet, Pastor Bruce came and joined us back in April of 2016 as our interim pastor, and we kind of liked him so much, he and Sherry, we decided to hang on to him and keep him around for a little while. So Pastor Bruce is serving as our care and teaching pastor. He's the one that goes and makes hospital visits and is mentoring some of our young men and just doing an amazing job. So we are so thankful for him, and we're thankful he's going to bring the word for us this morning. You guys give it up for Pastor Bruce. Come on.
Thank you, Pastor. Oh, boy. Wow. What a great day. I am the luckiest man in the world at my age to be asked to come into a great church like this. Did you know that we, Sherry and I, love this church? We love you because you are the church. And we're old, but boy, we sure get excited when we see all the young people come and all the babies being born. And so I am the luckiest guy in the world. What kind of people does God hear and answer their prayers? That's just a question I want to ask as we start today. Is God moved by extreme complacency? You know, is God moved by people who are very proud before God and with no needs? I think of the Pharisee as he pounded his chest that day in the sanctuary with the teaching that Jesus gave. Or I don't think that that's the type of person that I want to be. I don't want to be complacent. I don't want to be proud and with no needs before God. I want to be like the two people that we're going to look at today in Luke, the 8th chapter, and the two people happen to be desperate people before God. So how do we remain desperate before God? Needy people before God. And maybe we'll get some clues today. And wow, I like that. Keep your bulletin and look at it. Put it up on your refrigerator with all the rest of the junk. And desperate. That's the goal today. So let's look at God's word. Luke, the 8th chapter. Instead of reading the entire portion right now, I'm going to read it as we go through. So, okay, let's. This was the second year of Jesus' ministry. He had picked all his disciples. There were 12 of them in the chapters preceding. He names all of them, and it tells how he picked some of them, and he gets into his teaching. In the first year, he established his ministry, and in the second year of his ministry, the crowds were just huge. His ministry was exploding, and even at this point, the Pharisees were looking at him to try and figure out if he really was the Messiah. They were just honestly asking those questions. And the expectations were very, very high. And so verse number 40 of Luke, the 8th chapter says, "Now when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him." When he returned from where? Well, he had been in the area of Capernaum. He had been to the little town of Nain, not too far from there. had raised a young boy from the dead. And then he got into a boat with his disciples, and they crossed the Sea of Galilee, and they went to the Decapolis. And on their trip across, the wind was so fierce that the disciples feared they were going to drown, and they woke Jesus up, and he rebuked the wind. And they wondered, who is this? And once they got there, they went to a small town, and this man from Gadara came out, wildly possessed by demons and frothing, and the demons tried to kill him, and Jesus delivered him. And that young man who lived most of his life chained and in a cemetery, that man was set free by the power of Jesus, and he wanted to follow Jesus. And Jesus said, no, stay right here in this area and be a witness. And so now they get back in the boat, and they come back to the area of Capernaum, the northern part of the Sea of Galilee. And so that's what it says. When they returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. You know, when a crowd is excited and joy is flowing, it is a beautiful thing. Have you ever been to places like that? Church can be like that. People can come with expectations just to church. But it's interesting that even if the whole crowd is excited, I would dare to bet that there is always at least one person, and sometimes more than one person, who on that day is not thrilled about everything. For them, they had a recent diagnosis from a doctor, or a child had been hurt. Maybe their job was threatened, or maybe for them, there was the recent loss of a loved one. And for them, they are in the middle of a crowd that is excited and overwhelmed, but they're not feeling that way. And have you ever been there? Jairus was there. And verse number 41, the first part of verse 41 says, there was a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader. Everybody else was thrilled about the joy of Jesus, but Jairus was filled with fear on that day because his only daughter was dying, and she was 12 years old. And so it says here in verse 41 that he was a synagogue leader. Let me just talk for a moment about that. He was a very important and powerful man in his community. As the synagogue president, he was highly respected in the community, probably a wealthy man, a man of political and really religious influence. And so, as the president of the synagogue, he was the gatekeeper. He was the one who would choose who would read the Torah every Sunday. He was the one who would choose who would preach on that Sunday. And if he was like other synagogue leaders in that area, they were all being warned by the Pharisees not to allow Jesus into their churches to preach anymore, because this new gospel of his was taking root in the hearts of people. And the Pharisees were starting to stand up and say, do not allow them into the synagogue. Well, what this did was really take Jesus out of the synagogues that sometimes held dozens of people, scores of people, maybe the bigger ones, hundreds of people. And it took him out into the marketplaces. It took him out into the fields. It took him out into the countryside, where there were hundreds and at times thousands of people coming to hear his message. And so as I said, it was this first year of his ministry, the beginning of the second year, and his ministry was exploding. So Jairus was a powerful, influential person, and usually a person like Jairus, the synagogue leader or ruler, usually they're not the type to beg for anything. But this day was different. Jairus probably surprised everyone on that day when in verse 41, the second part of verse 41, Jairus, it says, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house. Wow. Wonder what the Pharisees who told him, do not allow Jesus into the synagogue, I wonder what they thought when in front of this huge crowd, Jairus comes and falls at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house. Not a very dignified thing for the president of a synagogue to do, but his daughter was dying. And like any loving father, he would set his pride aside and do whatever it takes to get help for his daughter. And so it is interesting that this is written up in 3 of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And in verse number 42, Luke is the only one who says, because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. Wow. I always try to put myself into the text. We have 3 wonderful boys. Love them to death. I always wanted a girl. Never got it. I can't imagine having an only daughter, an only child, and then to watch them in the process of dying. I can't even imagine that. It's interesting that Luke is the only one who says this is his only daughter. And it is also interesting that when he comes to Jesus and falls at his feet, he asks him simply to come to his house. He really doesn't ask him to heal his daughter. He says, please, please, come to my house. And Jesus said, yes, I will. Jesus said what he would say to you if you asked him to come to your house. And Jairus' hopes must have soared. They must have gone through the roof. Jesus was coming to his house to help his only daughter who was dying. However, in the second part of verse number 42, it says, as Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. Wow, that's an interesting verse. They were pressing around Jesus so hard that he just could not make any progress at all. The procession stopped, and Jairus must have become panic-stricken. And he must have wanted to shout to everybody, Jesus is coming to my house. And every minute is crucial. Every second is crucial. This is an occasion where you cannot be too late. And so, however, there was also in the crowd another needy person. In fact, another desperate person. A woman who was not dying, but a woman who was very ill with a chronic disease. Verse number 43 says, "And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. Wow. For a dozen years, she had this chronic medical condition, which was embarrassing for her. And it was also a very private matter for her. It's something that we still don't really usually talk about stuff like that, even today. For 12 years, she had an unchecked menstrual flow. Apparently some type of uterine hemorrhage. And she was not only sick, but she, with that loss of blood, she must have been sapped of strength. And it's hard to imagine. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it was really this. In those days, the rules of Jewish religion and their culture together said that she could not participate in worship at the synagogue or in the temple for as long as that flow continued. So now it had been 12 years. And so what is more, she could not touch anyone and have physical contact with them because she was considered religiously unclean. And that meant that no one could shake her hand once they realized that she was unclean. No one could hug her for a dozen years. It meant that she could have no physical contact with members of her family without making them unclean. She was socially, desperately isolated. And so now, verse 43, the second part says, but no one could heal her. It even gets worse for this woman. No one could heal her. That is a very sad verse indeed. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell her story, but Mark adds this verse. And this one might not be up there. I forgot to give this. So Mark 5, verse 25 says this: she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. Wow. It is interesting that Luke, being a physician himself, was not the one who mentioned this. It was Mark. That she had spent all her money and had suffered a great deal at the hands of physicians. Just kind of funny. I don't know. I'm not going to blame Luke. But this woman and Jairus, I just want to contrast them in a few points here. Jairus was rich, and this woman was poor. Jairus was a religious leader. This woman was a religious outcast. Jairus was respected in his community. She was avoided by everyone in her community. Nobody would want to come near her. Jairus was famous in his community, and the Bible doesn't even mention the name of this woman. It's really quite a contrast. But one thing they had in common that I want us all to catch this morning is that they were both desperate. They were both desperate. For her, Jesus was her only hope. And if he could not help her, there was no place for her to go. And there would be no place for her to turn. So she made her way through the crowd. And I try to picture her snaking her way through the crowd. Would she stick her hand in and try and push herself in front of other people? Because she had to be very careful, first of all, so she wouldn't be recognized. So she probably had her head covered. Maybe she had a hoodie. Today we would see someone like that sneaking through the crowd and we might get scared, you know. For she would religiously taint anyone that she brushed up against. So seeking full anonymity, she weaved her way through the crowd to get close enough to Jesus to reach out, maybe in between other people, to reach out and just touch him. And it says, in the King James I love, it says when she finally got to him, she reached out and touched the hem of his garment. Just imagine that. That's all she could accomplish. That's all she wanted to accomplish. She didn't want to let everyone know who she was. She didn't want to talk to Jesus and let everyone find out what her issue was. But verse number 44 says, she came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. Listen to this. And immediately her bleeding stopped. She knew instantly that she was healed. And she was thrilled. That had to be the biggest thrill of her life. And, but at that moment, Jesus turns around. And in verse 45, he says, "Who touched me?" When they all denied it, I assume her also, you know. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding around and pressing you." It seemed like an absurd question on Jesus' part. Who had touched him? Maybe half the people in the crowd who were bumping up against him. Maybe hundreds of people had touched him. But Jesus knew that this touch was different. It was not a casual brushing up against. It was not a bump or a press in the crowd. She had reached out and touched Jesus with her faith. And the power of God flowed out of Jesus into her body. There was a connection to her body, and she was instantly healed. And again, in verse 46, Jesus asked the question again. Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me. And Jesus, in that moment, would not allow her to remain anonymous. Verse 47 says this: when the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. This is the second person this day who fell at Jesus' feet, because it's the second desperate person. She fell at his feet, and in the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Interesting here that Jesus insisted that she be identified. And at first, this might seem like a major invasion of her privacy, or he's doing something that is going to radically embarrass her in front of this crowd. But Jesus, when we really look at this, Jesus knew that this was necessary for her. This was unlike the situation of the blind man who was healed. When he was healed, everybody knew it. He could see. Or like the paralytic, remember the man who was paralyzed from birth and had never walked. And when he walked, what did he do? He went walking and leaping and praising God, and everybody knew it. But those would be apparent, but her condition was such that the only way that she could be readmitted back into society, to social and spiritual relationships, was that she would have to go to the rabbi, and the rabbi would have to give these embarrassing examinations, and maybe she would become there would be embarrassing gossip about her. And so Jesus wanted to save her from all of that. And so he used his authority as a rabbi to declare that she was healed, so that she would be welcomed back with hugs and kisses into her family and into her circle of friends to worship God in the synagogue and worship God in the temple. Isn't that loving of Jesus? Isn't that kind of Jesus? Doesn't he take the ministry and just tailor it to her great, great needs? And so then he says to her in verse 48, listen to these great words that he says to a desperate person. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Woohoo! Declared healed by a rabbi. Declared healed. What a happy day that was for her. 12 years times 365. I multiplied it out. 4,380 rotten days in a row. That's a lot of days in a row. And now this is her first, number one, great day. She has been healed by Jesus. It was glorious. It was glorious for her. But for Jairus, oh boy, it was the worst possible thing that could have happened. His daughter was dying. Every minute counted. This woman had been sick for 12 years. What difference does it make if she waits one more day? His daughter was dying. And now Jesus is completely stopped by the crowd. They almost crushed him, and he just can't move. Verse 49 says, while Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader, and said, your daughter is dead. He said, don't bother the teacher anymore. Whew. Bummer. If you try and put yourself into that whole situation, how sad. I can't help but wonder if there was some sarcasm in the message that this person brought. Some resentment that rolled out in this statement. Don't bother the teacher anymore. This teacher who can't move along fast when he needs to, who can't get his priorities straight. He doesn't know the difference between a girl who needs attention right now, a 12-year-old, and a woman who's been sick for 12 years and can wait one more day. I think of the principles of ER. Our son Chris was the charge nurse at Methodist Hospital in St. Louis Park. And And so one of the things they had to determine, he first was a head of triage and then became the charge nurse. With triage, he had to be the one who would say, do this, do that, do that. This one goes first. This one goes second. Do this on that one. And and I'm sure the doctors did that together. But the words that Jairus heard, the worst words by far, were this: your daughter is dead. Hearing this, Jesus says to Jairus, verse number 50, don't be afraid, just believe, and she will be healed. Wow. There's something that Jairus hadn't even thought of up until this point. Did these words of Jesus border on nonsense? Jairus had never considered the possibility that his daughter might be reached beyond death. So, did Jesus really have the power to do something like that, extend life on the other side of death? I have to hand it to this man. He still took Jesus to his home. That's kind of a big deal. His daughter was already gone. Many people were angry, some probably cynical. Bring this guy to the home who didn't care enough to hurry? Some might say, don't bother. What was Jairus thinking? He must have had all kinds of thoughts running through his head. And the predominant thought must have been, you never know what Jesus will do when he comes to the house. You never know what Jesus can do. Verse number 51 says this: when he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, James, and John, the child's father and mother, and there was a sixth one who went in. Who would that be? Jesus. So meanwhile, verse 52, all the people were wailing and mourning for her outside. So, an interesting principle here. Who do you take into the home? Do you take those who are wailing and mourning in? No, you take people of faith. And he took the six people. The six people that went in were people of faith. But verse 52 says, meanwhile, they were wailing and mourning outside. For us, this seems strange, almost inappropriate, that people should be paid to be mourners at a funeral. But who are we to criticize how other people deal with death? It's the great difficulty. And in those days, and it's still the case today in that region, that burial must take place before sundown. And so they only had a few hours now to wash their dear daughter's body, to lay her out probably in her bedroom, and to say their last goodbyes. It was a very sad day. And the sounds of the mourners outside somehow probably seemed appropriate. And I remember when we were with our dear friends, Linda and Galen, Dean and Lita, we were going into Disney World, and we got the phone call. Linda decided to call just to see how Kayla was. Kayla was about 2 years old and back in Wisconsin with dear friends, and she called and got this sick look on her face, and she said she was told that they're not sure if Kayla's alive. She had just gone limp, and they had the rescue team there. They were trying to revive her, and we got in our car and headed back to the hotel, and she couldn't make the call. She asked me to make the call, and I did, and Sherry said, not my Sherry, but Sherry Anderson said, they could not revive her. Kayla died. And I just remember how sad it was. They got on a plane, flew back. We drove the car back. at that funeral with that little styrofoam coffin on a cold January day. We left it in the cemetery, sitting on top. Linda is such a rational person, and she said, I want to put a winter coat on her. And she did. And it was such a sad thing when someone young dies. And this day, it was Jairus's and his wife's turn to sadly mourn. And then, with a boldness that almost seems laughable, Jesus said, "Stop wailing. She is not dead." And verse 53 says, the mourners laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. Well, I'll tell you, even the mourners couldn't keep a straight face when Jesus said, she's not dead. They laughed out loud. They were being paid to cry, and yet those yahoos laughed out loud. And Jesus, is he completely crazy? Didn't he know that she really was dead? Of course he knew that she was dead. This was not his diagnosis. This was his prognosis. He was telling them that he knew she was dead, and he was fixing to heal her. And he was going to demonstrate his power over death by awakening her as if it were from sleep. That would be the kind of power he would have. So again, 6 people went into the house that day. None of the mourners were allowed, only people of faith. And so it must have been intense. The hearts must have been pounding, and there must have been skepticism and doubt. And if you were walking in with them, would you have some skepticism? If I'm really honest with myself, I might have been skeptical. I might have had to stand outside with the paid mourners. This was a big deal, what Jesus said he was going to do. And I probably would have had my doubts. But verse 54 says, but he took her by the hand and said, in his own native Aramaic, my child, get up. My child, get up. Listen to this. Verse 55. Her spirit returned. Where was her spirit? To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. Her spirit had gone to the Lord. Jesus heals her, and the Father sends her spirit back. And verse 55 said, her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Woohoo! That is exactly what Jesus is going to do on resurrection morning. There is coming a day soon, way sooner than probably anybody knows, when the trumpets are going to sound and resurrection morning is going to happen, and people who have died 5,000 years ago and have turned to dust, God is going to do something miraculous. He's going to recreate a physical body, and Abraham's not going to be 100 some years old, and God is going to send those spirits back, and the body and the soul is going to be reunited on resurrection morning. Oh, brother. And that's going to happen as surely as I'm standing here. And so what a great day that's going to be. Wow. And we are going to say this. We're going to look back on our short period of time that we had here on earth. Maybe 70 years, the Bible says, 80 if we're real lucky. I'm in my 69th right now. And we're going to look back on this short period of time. And we're going to say at that moment, when we are going to be made into his likeness with our new body and the new spirit, and we're going to say it was worth serving him every minute of our life. It was worth loving him and living for him. And so Jesus did it. He overpowered death. And then Jesus says in the second part of verse 55, Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Have you ever noticed what food does to a person who's famished? Maybe white, and I just can't imagine someone who had been dead. And she takes food, and I remember when Brandon was born, and he came out blue. And I'm going to the doctor, Schreppel, is he supposed to be blue? And he says, no. And I said, should I panic? And he said, not yet. And he picked him up by the feet, and he slapped his little behind. And he went, he breathed in, and he was as blue as could be, and everything got pink. And he went, ah! And he got pinker. And he breathed in again, and all of a sudden, he was completely pink. And the nurse said, you got a little redhead. Oh, and I wish he had stayed red, because my dad always wanted a redhead. Anyway, this is great. Verse number 55, Jesus said, give her something to eat. Verse 56, her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone. So, in essence, he says, don't sign a book contract, don't call a press conference, don't do what people would normally do today. And he said, I want you to pay attention to your daughter. And she needs privacy. She needs to understand what happened to her today. And all I can say is, holy buckets. That is true. And then apparently the sad job fell on Peter and the gang. They were the ones that had to go outside and say to the crowd, I'm sorry, the funeral has been canceled. Have you ever had an appointment canceled, or have you ever had a lunch date canceled? I sure have, but I've never had a funeral canceled. But Jesus did more than once. And so I've even seen a few weddings canceled, but never a funeral. And so I'm sure it was Peter, because Peter always has the biggest mouth. I'm sure he had to go out and say something like this. And, oh, by the way, you paid mourners will not be paid. Go home and laugh about that. Oh, brother. And so it is beautiful how Jesus gives exactly what is needed. To one, it's a personal spoken word. To another, it's a touch. Some he heals instantly. Some have to wait for a period of time. Some have to be identified right away. They're healing. Others, he says, keep quiet. And so it is the same for me, and it is the same for you. Jesus will do what you need the most, and he will kindly customize his ministry to fit your greatest need, and that will work into his will for your life the best. And so what do we do in closing? What did we learn today from these desperate people? Well, I think, number one, never be too proud to fall at Jesus' feet and beg. I think we learned today we need to invite Jesus into our home and then be surprised and shocked by what he does. I think we learned today we need to sometimes push our way through the crowd and reach out and touch him with our faith. Not just brush up against or not just be a part of the crowd. We need to individually touch him today. In a few moments, our elders will come and they'll be ready to pray with people. And if you need prayer, have it in your mind that you are going to personally touch Jesus today and let them help you in that process. We need to believe. I think we learned today that we need to believe in Jesus even when it's gone way beyond what we think is controllable anymore. Even when it seems to be too late, we need to trust Jesus boldly. And so I want to remain before God as a desperate person, as a needy person before God. I have great health care insurance through Mayo Clinic. My wife worked there for 30 years. And believe me, we really have some great health care insurance. But I don't want to become this guy before God that has the posture, I got mail. I might need you, I might not, I don't want to do that. I thank God for mail, but I want to remain desperate before God. And it's not easy. In this day and age, when we are told to be independent in every way and to meet our own needs, it's not easy. So, like the parents who were so desperate and were astonished on that day, woohoo! Like the little girl, the 12-year-old, whose spirit had left and came back to her. Wow. Isn't that a great part of the story? Like the woman with the issue of blood who put her hoodie on and sneaked through and probably pushed people aside and wormed her way to get right to Jesus and reached out and touched him. Touched him what? With her faith. Isn't that beautiful? And like Jairus, who had everything going for him, but was not too proud to come needy before God himself and fall on his knees and beg him. Praise God. Let's just close in prayer. Father, I do thank you for these two people. We don't even know her name. We will see her in heaven. And I plan on talking to her someday. Oh, Lord, what we learn from these people, Lord, help us. Put it into our hearts to be people of faith. Woman, thy faith has made you whole. Put it in our hearts to be men and women, boys and girls of faith who can trust Jesus even when everything looks at its worst. And so, God, I thank you for these dear people. I thank you for a crowd that is thrilled and excited to come to your house on a Sunday. But yet, Lord, I think there are those here who are like Jairus or like this woman, desperate. And so, Lord, our prayers today are with them. Give them faith. Give them strength where they are not strong. Make them strong where they are feeble. Oh God, build them up so that we can come to you and ask great things of you, because you are a great God. And Jesus, you are the greatest Son that ever lived. You were obedient in every way to your Father's will. We love you. We would give our life for you. Oh, Jesus. Bless your people today as we go. In your wonderful name. And everybody said, amen. Be desperate before God.